Thank you all for being here today, and I'd like to thank the Dean Jensen, Dean Jim Trent also, and the College of Engineering for the invitation to come speak with you today. I'd also like to thank family and friends who are here today to support and hopefully not to heckle. Given the precedent that was set on Sunday, I feel like I should shorten this talk by 33% so that you can all study these principles at home with your families. And by that laughter, I think you'll all agree that's a good idea. As some of you may know from my bio, I haven't actually spent a single day as an engineer in my career. So this invitation to speak today came as much as a surprise to me as it may have to some of you. I do have a degree in electrical engineering, as was pointed out, and a minor in math. So I ran some quick calcs and determined that there was an equal probability that I'm here as an example of what not to do, as much as an example of what to do. There's also a very good chance that I was the alternate for today, which the dean refuses to acknowledge, but I'm accepting that there's a chance. Several years ago, as I was preparing to leave my job as a venture capitalist in Boston to attend business school, the managing partner of our firm called me into his office for an exit interview. I'd worked directly for him for 2 years and respected him deeply, but also found him very intimidating. He had 2 degrees from MIT and a degree from Harvard. He was on the board of several public companies, including MIT. He was a regent at the Smithsonian Institution. And he was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and had most recently served as president of the Washington Post Company, where he worked with Kay Graham, who you all probably are familiar with from the recent film The Post, where part of her life was chronicled. He said 2 things to me in that conversation that I remember to this day. The first was a question, and he asked me, "Why do you think I hired you?" And a lot of thoughts raced through my mind about why he might have hired me. Desperation, didn't pay enough to attract anybody else. A lot of things. He said this. He said, "I knew if you could get an engineering degree from BYU and serve a Mormon mission, that you could handle anything that I would throw at you." As he said to me, "As you know, I have a degree in engineering, and I know several Mormons, and I know that serving a mission is a hard thing." Now, he said Mormon. I know he meant the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The second thing he said was, "Be careful when you graduate with your fancy degree that people without fancy degrees don't run circles around you." And that meant a lot to him because he had spent years in the bowels of a newspaper organization where he met a lot of people with pretty impressive tenacity and resourcefulness. And he wanted me to be prepared for the time when I left business school and entered the real world, as he called it. And he wanted me to know that I needed to keep working hard to succeed and be successful. He didn't want me to forget it. I've thought a lot about those 2 things that he shared in the years since. And one thing that sticks out to me is that his comments had nothing to do with intelligence or personality, good looks, obviously. They had to do with effort. And as I reflected on that interview and hundreds of other life experiences I've had in family and church and work, school, I've realized that while some threshold level of intelligence is required to access many paths to success in life, that it's not what makes the difference. It's effort that sets us apart. So as you listen to what I share this morning, please keep in mind that I have an MBA, so I'm not actually qualified to give you any advice, mostly just to tell stories. So that's what I'll do. My bio mentioned that I grew up on a farm in Woodburn. This is a picture of part of that farm, our garden where I grew up. Working our family of 8 was the expectation. Before my parents went soft on the younger ones, that is. Good grades were expected, not really rewarded. Summers were filled with a daily schedule of work units. That's what we actually called them. Outside the house, we were expected to have jobs doing things like picking berries or harvesting worms. True story and super gross. And at home, we were expected to chip in, mowing the yard, weeding the garden, and cleaning the house. Later, to reinforce good behavior, our yard was encircled by an electric fence. That part's true. In this first picture, you see me and my sister, who's actually here today in the garden. What you may not see in her hand are 2 green beans, the same 2 beans she stole from me right before this picture was taken. Always keep an eye out for people trying to steal your hard work. That's one important lesson from childhood. This is another picture of childhood work units. In later pictures, I'm just carrying more wood, so I just figured I'd show you that one. And here's a picture of garden work. I had just filled that wheelbarrow full of ears of corn. My brothers are still smiling because they don't know what's coming. We still have the whole rest of the garden to do. As a young kid, I don't remember seeing my parents watch TV. I don't remember seeing them just sitting around. My dad was a full-time firefighter and a full-time student, pursuing his bachelor's and master's degrees and completing work toward a PhD. Around the firehouse, they always used to call him doctor. My mom worked hard raising our family of 8 on a tight budget and literally helped my dad through school, writing his paper or typing his papers and proofreading and helping him study. As kids, in addition to doing our own work, we mostly focused a lot on creating more work for my mom. When my dad's career took us away from the farm to a new city, work was still the expectation. I remember the first job I got when we moved to that new town was pulling weeds out of the crack in the sidewalk on the road into town where conveniently every kid in my new high school could see me. Awesome. I remember getting A's in school, which made people think I was smart, and I don't remember feeling smart. In fact, that label has always made me feel a little uncomfortable. I've always known people that were much smarter than me, and I felt like assuming that label was somehow being disingenuous. In my graduating class in high school, I was one of 12 valedictorians, but even then there were 12 of us, so I didn't feel like I was that unique. I remember feeling I was only smarter than one of them. He played football. I just remember feeling like the grades came because I worked hard and I studied for tests, but mostly just because that was what was expected of me. In fact, not so funny note for me, but the first B I got that I remember getting from kind of middle school on was actually winter semester of freshman year at BYU and Health 129, Health and Lifestyle Fitness. Does anybody remember that? Any other victims of that here? No. Before today, I was ashamed to admit it as well, so I don't expect you to admit it, but it's taken me a long time to get over that. I don't know that I have still to this day. I look back on growing up, and I feel like my path was most influenced by these 3 things. My parents set a clear example of work ethic and expected the same thing from me. They emphasized the importance of education and taught me that college would put me on a path where I could achieve success. And we came from pretty humble circumstances. So I know that the only way I could afford college was to get a job, save money from that work, and then earn a scholarship. When it came time to go to BYU, I struggled, as most of us do, I think, trying to choose a major. And I asked my dad for advice. He asked me if I was passionate about anything, and I asked him what that meant. And he said, something that you could see yourself doing for work that you would be passionate about. And the childhood trauma of work units kind of came to my mind, and I asked him, people are passionate about work? And he said, yeah. I said, well, I don't know what that would be. So he gave me advice, which I later discovered was very similar to the advice that Mimi Hanks from the college gives her kids, or has given her kids, which is if I didn't know what I wanted to do, that I should focus on a technical or a hard major, one that would require me to work really hard to be the best. And he said it would open the door to many career paths. And as Mimi points out, it would help build the confidence because I was able to do a hard thing. Ultimately, I chose electrical engineering for 3 reasons. I knew I liked technology, so for most of you out there, just so you know, that's not wheels and pulleys. We actually had the World Wide Web in the 1990s, and the Discman and MP3 players and a lot of other swell goodies back then. 2, I felt like engineering would challenge me, and if my dad was right, it would differentiate me. And 3, I looked up electrical engineering in the career services office, and it had the second highest starting salary of any major at BYU. So I said I'd sign up for that. Engineering was tough. So much of it didn't come natural to me. It required a lot of late hours in the lab, on projects, on homework, with teams, preparing for tests. And it taught me a lot about all of those areas, a lot about teamwork and working with other people, problem solving. But it also taught me about resilience and work ethic. And most importantly, it ended up influencing the course of the rest of my career, which leads me to the second interview experience that I'll share with you. It was junior year, and my brother, who's here, had introduced me to the world of management consulting. He described it as solving problems for a variety of Fortune 500 companies with a group of really smart people, and I thought it sounded really interesting. So I attended the management consulting fair on campus and learned that 2 of the firms would be hiring for summer interns. I applied to both. The first firm rejected me without an interview. The second, Monitor, gave me what I later learned was an alternate slot in the interview schedule. I know I was an alternate because I showed up for the interview and he said, "You're an alternate." I said, "Okay, can I stay?" He said, "We had an opening in the schedule and decided to interview you because you're an engineer, and that was different. You definitely didn't have the highest test scores or the most interesting background, but I wanted to interview an engineer, so here we are." Thank you, I remember saying. I ended up getting an offer with that firm to go to Cambridge, Massachusetts for the summer to work as a management consultant, and I absolutely loved it. I met, my brother actually came with me that summer, lots of interesting people from elite liberal arts schools that I'd never heard of, who played sports that I had never heard of, crew and field hockey. What's that? I had no idea. I loved learning new things, and I felt like it was something I could really see myself doing after graduation. Unfortunately, that was the summer of 2001, and we didn't know it at the time, but we were living through the depths of the bubble burst from the collapse of internet stocks. And one day near the end of the program, they bussed us off campus to a local hotel and told us that because of the dire economic circumstances that they wouldn't be able to offer many of us jobs to return for full-time positions following school. And they said they divide us into three rooms, and only one of those rooms would be getting offers to come back. And when I got to my room, I recognized a lot of the people in the room from those that I had seen in the office late, oftentimes past midnight, the people I thought who were working the hardest to learn the most in both their consulting tradecraft and also on the cases that they had worked on. They were the ones who put forth what I thought was the most effort. And when I saw them, I knew we were the few who were going to get full-time offers to come back, even in the depths of the recession. Eventually, I returned to Monitor after BYU and loved all that I learned about consulting and business. It was brutally difficult at times, though, and we often referred to it as our business boot camp. After many, many nights sleeping under my desk, I decided that I really wanted to graduate from boot camp. So late one night, on a project with a colleague, we got carried away in a discussion about what life might be like outside of boot camp. And she mentioned that her boyfriend had just gotten a job in venture capital and that it was awesome. He said that from one day to the next, he made twice as much money and worked half as much. And I thought that sounded very interesting. So I asked her how he did it, and she said he worked with a headhunter in New York. So I cold called the headhunter the next day and told her I would like to sign up for that program. I didn't say that, but I wanted to. And I found out that she was handling a search for a venture capital associate for a firm in Boston, but that it had been very difficult to fill that search because they were looking for someone who had an engineering undergraduate degree and strategy consulting experience. And I said, I'm your guy. 18 months later, or 18 interviews and several months later, I accepted an offer to join the firm. And similar to consulting, I loved working as an investor. I learned about businesses in a variety of different industries, which I loved. And I loved learning about the people who came up with those ideas. I was fascinated by entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurial process. Over the years as a venture capitalist, I was involved in investments in a lot of companies, and my firm made investments in hundreds. Across all those experiences with entrepreneurs and industries, I observed a recurring theme, two recurring themes related to effort, and it's these. First, I saw that while many entrepreneurs weren't necessarily brilliant by IQ standards, they were nevertheless all experts in their fields. But they weren't born with that expertise, they acquired it. They approached a market or an unmet need with some level of skill and intelligence, but more than that, they applied a phenomenal amount of effort to solve really hard problems. Training, experience, and personal effort is what set them apart. I also realized that the economy rewarded them for their expertise. In my case, I saw entrepreneurial experts in niche fields like small parcel logistics or on-demand printing or liquid supplement manufacturing all be handsomely rewarded by the economy. And I decided that I wanted to be an expert, that I wanted to achieve expertise. There are, of course, a lot of ways that you can be rewarded by the economy. An example that people often point out is winning the lottery. It's hard to actually influence that, so it turns out that our effort is best placed in areas where we can make a difference without relying on the externality of luck or happenstance. The problem with this is that as a society, we don't see it that way. As Malcolm Gladwell points out, as a society, we actually value natural, effortless accomplishment. We value that because we see that people achieve it in a way that appears to not require a lot of work. If you have to work for something, you must not be good at it. We use phrases like natural talent, which conjure the image of Steve Young emerging from the womb and throwing a spiral, which isn't actually possible. That's not actually how it works. What's interesting is I actually felt the same way. I had that same thought process. And it actually revealed itself when I was taking the ACT as I was preparing to apply to school. I thought that if I really was smart like other people thought I was, that I wouldn't need to study and work hard. That if I was smart, that I could get a good score on the ACT. And as a result, I didn't put in the work that I should have to study and prepare. And I got a score that probably wouldn't get me into BYU today, and certainly wouldn't get me a scholarship to BYU today. So when it came time to apply to business school, I decided that I wasn't going to repeat that same mistake. So for the GMAT, I actually got up at 5 every morning for weeks to study practice questions and spent hours every Saturday doing practice tests in the city library in Boston. And I did it until I took the first test. And the first test, I got a score that wasn't high enough, wasn't what I needed it to be. So I repeated the process all over again until I got the score I wanted. The challenge is that in spite of our reverence for these legends, historical people that we consider to be super bright, like Einstein and Darwin and Tolstoy, the reality is that they were all considered ordinary as children. Amelia Earhart was the same. Michael Jordan was the same. The story of him getting cut from his high school varsity basketball team is very well known. As we know, they all eventually achieve greatness through lifelong, dogged pursuit of their goals. Darwin and Einstein obviously shaped modern scientific theory. Tolstoy is regarded as one of the greatest authors of all time. Amelia Earhart was the first female aviator to cross the Atlantic. Jordan is widely considered to be the best basketball player of all time. And I'm sure there are some LeBron James fans in the audience today. You're millennials, though, so that explains that. Even after failure, all of these people tried and tried and tried until they succeeded. It's that effort that really set them apart. On this topic of expertise and talent, one famous military and test pilot, Chuck Yeager, who was the first human to break the speed of sound in 1947, had the right view of effort. He said his flying career spanned 60 years. A lot of people called him a natural, a born pilot. And he said, there is no such thing as a natural born pilot. The best pilots fly more than the others. That's why they're the best. Experience is everything. In other words, what he was saying are, pilots aren't born the best. They're not naturals. They're just the ones who put forth the most effort. Some of you may be familiar with this book. It was from renowned Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck. She's conducted very interesting research on the topic of effort. If you haven't read her book, Mindset, you're probably still familiar with some of her theories. Some of the most controversial or popular ones are that we shouldn't praise our children for being smart. We should praise them for their effort, that it's actually harmful to just praise them for their intelligence. In summary, her view is that successful people tend to focus on growth, solving problems, and self-improvement, what she calls an open mindset, while unsuccessful people think of their abilities, for example, their intelligence, as fixed and avoid challenges. She said, no matter what your current ability is, think of this in the context of musical gifts or gifts in math or other areas of academics or athletics. Effort is what ignites the ability, that ability, and turns it into accomplishment. She pointed out in her research in her book that NASA doesn't choose astronauts based on ability. They choose them based on having worked through difficult problems and been successful in spite of them. She also suggested that applying a growth mindset can influence how smart you are, that your achievement as a student isn't fixed. You can tell where a student is, but you can't tell where a student ends up. What I found really interesting is that the guy who invented the IQ test actually thought the same thing. So the guy whose research has been used to categorize intelligence and bucket us at levels of intelligence actually believed that it wasn't a fixed asset. A few modern philosophers assert that an individual's intelligence is a fixed quantity, a quantity which cannot be increased. We must protest. With practice, training, and above all method, we manage to increase our attention, our memory, our judgment, and literally to become more intelligent than we were before. The last one I'll point out is research conducted by Angela Duckworth. You may not be familiar with her book. It's an excellent read, but you probably have heard her or others talk about some of her research at West Point or the National Spelling Bee. West Point was having a hard time figuring out how they could predict which candidates would succeed in the program. They had all these tests about candidate profile or readiness or grades in school or intelligence, but it turned out none of those predicted who would succeed in the program. And the same with the spelling bee. People were curious whether it was just raw intelligence that caused people to win at the spelling bee. You'd all probably guess that push-ups and sit-ups wouldn't necessarily predict success in the spelling bee, but would you guess the same of West Point's basic training program, which they call BEAST? And the answer is it wasn't true there either. In fact, it wasn't fitness, intelligence, or personality that made people successful. Her research predicted that success in both cases was driven by one thing, grit, which she defined as passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. In other words, effort over the long run. It was grit or sustained effort that predicted high achievement. as she said, without effort, talent is nothing more than your unmet potential. Without effort, your skill is nothing more than what you could have done but didn't. In other words, regardless of how talented we are, regardless of wherever we start our path of ability, without effort, we won't be able to achieve our full potential. So I've had lots of conversations over the years with people, students, colleagues, about this topic of effort. And typically 3 questions come up. How much effort is required for me to be successful? How do I achieve the right work-life balance as I'm pursuing success? And how do I know when I'm getting out of balance? So, as a result of all these conversations with colleagues and mentees, I sort of put together this framework to answer the first question about the effort required to be successful. And if you think about this very simple framework of just your success, the success you achieve over time, think of success in the context of whatever your current endeavor is. So building a family, building a career, experience in church, school, however you define success, think of that as what you're trying to achieve. And over the course of time, you'll pursue some trajectory. For this example, let's assume we're focused specifically on your career. So you'll choose which career trajectory that you want to pursue over time. And the important thing here is that the slope of that curve is the effort that you'll have to put forth to achieve a certain amount of success over a certain period of time. Now, the catch is this. You have the agency to choose whatever your slope is, but others won't always agree that your chosen slope is acceptable. So there is a scenario where you choose a slope that's too shallow because you're not comfortable with exerting that level of effort, and you'll be fired. Or you'll be excused from the program, or you won't be admitted to the program. It's also true that you could be so ambitious and exert so much effort that you'll burn out. But within those 2 bands, you have some freedom to determine what effort you're willing to exert. Here's why that matters. At any given point in time, again in this context in your career, T, the outcome of success is dramatically different. So on the lower curve, you would achieve success corresponding to point B. On the upper curve, you would achieve success corresponding to point A. It's not to scale here, but the idea is that in theory, those could be dramatically different levels of success, 2x the difference. And so what you really need to determine is, are you achieving as you go the level of success that you have designed, that you have set as a goal? And if you haven't, the answer will almost always be to exert more effort toward whatever that chosen goal is. Now, the second question, how do I achieve the right work-life balance, I think is the single most popular question. Whether or not it's voiced, it's always the one people are wondering about. I remember when I was a student at business school, we had very successful people come speak, and that was the question I always wanted to ask, but I didn't want to seem like the guy who was trying to get away without working really hard, but still achieving a lot of success. So I didn't ask it as much as I wanted, but I imagine it's on your mind a lot. And here is the reality. We don't really achieve balance at a single point in time. We achieve balance over time. So when you think about your career, your schoolwork, there will be times when getting the job done requires a significant amount of effort and singular focus. It will be obvious to you, as it was to me when I was sleeping under my desk, that you are at that moment not achieving balance. That's okay. As we know from Ecclesiastes, there is a season, and you'll just need to give thought and prayerful consideration to the sequence and duration of those seasons. You want to have a plan, and you want to make sure that your spouse agrees with your plan, or those seasons spoken of in Ecclesiastes may feel like dark winters. So just always keep that in mind. The third one, how do I know when I'm getting out of balance? And this is a sensitive one because I think People don't always talk about this concern, even though it's a very real concern for a lot of people. And I don't pretend to understand this topic fully, but I can tell you that in my own personal experience, there tend to be three categories of indicators when you are out of balance in your pursuit of whatever level of success that you've designed to accomplish. And the first is physical. I've literally had periods in my career where I've had migraine headaches because I was out of balance, that my effort was unsustainable, and my body was telling me that I had pushed too far. So be sensitive to those. Obviously, there are a variety of things that could precipitate any of these conditions, but you may, as you think about it, recognize things that are caused just because you've chosen a slope that's a bit too steep as you're pursuing your success. The second is emotional. My wife will attest to this. When you're pushing really hard and you get stressed out, it's very possible that you become irritable or anxious about things. And that's when it's nice to have a friend who's willing to say, hey, you're being a jerk today. What's going on? Are you stressed at work, or how's school? How's that test going? A very real factor. And then the third is spiritual. The concept that we learn about in D&C 9, this stupor of thought, expresses itself in that way often, and for you, probably in many other different ways. I want to circle back on this theme of effort before I close here. Talk about effort in many facets of life. It's interesting, if you think about it, the gospel is a gospel of effort. Here are two examples that I think highlight that. In Mosiah 5, therefore I would that ye should be steadfast and immovable, always abounding in good works, that ye may have eternal life. Or in Matthew, but he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. Those really are messages of grit, of the effort required to endure to the end, because if you don't put forth effort, then you just simply won't make it. I encourage you to think about this concept as you pursue all of your activities in life. What you'll find is that they all require quite a bit of effort to be successful. Don't get stuck in the trap of assuming that any ability is fixed. Don't get stuck with this notion that you were born to this earth with some level of intelligence that was predetermined by your genetics. It's really difficult to think about what that means in concept, but the implications are pretty astounding. It means that we really can do anything that we're willing to exert effort to achieve. And with all of those options available to us, with all the areas where we could exert that effort, we really have to think about where we need to invest that time and invest that resource. And I like this quote by Carol Dweck, because it really comes down to a prioritization. This is definitely something I can do better at, but I completely agree with her. You have to work the hardest for things you love the most. And there'll be a lot of those competing priorities as you pursue your careers and you grow your families. And you just need to always make sure that you're exerting that finite amount of effort that you have on the things that you love the most. I hope that as you think about this, that in some way you're emboldened, you're inspired to think that through effort you truly can accomplish great things in all facets of your life. I am a big believer in the BYU education. I'm a big believer in the stepping stone that BYU is for you and the rest of your lives, not just your careers. And it is my thrill to be able to come back and see students and participate events and see how incredibly talented and capable you are, far more than I feel like we were when we were here, and it's pretty humbling. But what it really tells me is you all should have a tremendous amount of confidence that you can go forth and really change the world. And I leave that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you.